Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Seeing familiar faces, Kristen, Avi, and seeing a bunch of new faces. So welcome. We're going to let everyone trickle in. My name is Kehi, if you don't know me, and I'm joined by my colleague, Marion Noble. We are also, if you're watching this on the live streams, good to see everyone. We're going to have time for Q&A today. So depending, obviously, Marian is coordinating all of the questions. So you can ask the questions on whatever social platform you're watching this on. You can ask questions in the chat here, and she will be feeding me the questions. So as people trickle in, I want you to drop in two things. Drop in what city you are coming in from, and then in one word, what is your relationship to your current career? Right? So city, comma, one word, relationship to current career. Obviously, we're talking about different work-related things, different career trajectories. So let's drop those in, and we will get started. All right. Avi's from Jerusalem, positive, grateful, unsure from Ventura, right up north from me. I'm in LA. All right. So we are going to let these questions come in. So here's how today's going to go. Basically, it's a talk. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own experience in leaving a high-paying job. And then I'm going to give you kind of a light framework through a series of questions. And then we'll open it up to Q&A, and we'll end at about 11:50. And again, Marian will be gathering the questions. So let us jump in. It was 8 years ago. I was 35 years old. I had a newborn, a 10-month-old or less than 10-month-old daughter. My wife was going to stay home and raise our daughter. And I basically sent an email to my boss, my big boss, saying, I'm so grateful for everything you have provided to me, every opportunity, but I'm moving on. I quit. I resign. I'm tendering my resignation. And so I had been working in financial services for 15 years at that point, but I had been trying my hardest to get on the fast track career track since I was probably 15 years old, teaching myself how to code, learning how to invest in the stock market. 15-year-old me believed that, and I grew up lower middle class, that money and financial security would deliver happiness. And so from age 15 till that moment at age 35, I was just playing the game of financial security, of safety, which slowly, very quietly morphed into one of status and of power, so to speak, and ultimately realizing that it was not fulfilling me and that it was time for me to move on. So I was 35 years old. I'm 44. I'll be turning 44 in 2 weeks. That journey since, so I quit and I didn't have a plan. And we can talk about this. I wouldn't recommend it. But I quit and I didn't have a plan. The only plan was to continue to tinker. I had been a tinkerer for a long time while I was working on Wall Street. I was trying to build apps. I was blogging anonymously. I was organizing in-person meetups. I was teaching people productivity courses. I was curating articles for them to read. I had so many different tinkering hobbies, and that was a job. That was a 60 to 70 hour a week job. So this was outside of that 70 hours that I was doing the tinkering. The one bet that I made that I made on myself in that process was, if I could tinker for an hour a day while I'm working 60 to 70 hours a week, imagine what would happen if I tinkered for 60 to 70 hours a week. That was the bet that I was making on myself, and a belief that something would emerge if I gave myself the space to do that. Here we are. Rad Reads has been a company I started by myself. The company grew to some contractors. We then built a full kind of W-2 organization. We grew a lot during COVID. Online learning was a really, really big thing. And then when COVID, quote unquote, ended, or when people started to resume their daily lives, our business took a big hit. And so we have shrunk since. The theme throughout those 8 years has been writing. Has been writing and teaching around the topics, around the Rad Reads mission of how to lead, helping high-performing individuals lead productive, examined, and joyful lives. That's been the mission. It's manifested in a lot of different forms. Again, the one through line has been writing and these kind of workshops and videos, but basically the act of creativity. And we've monetized it in a variety of different ways, which we can talk about. So I'm going to go in and share my screen. That gives you a little bit of the backdrop. Again, feel free to start, dropping in questions into the chat. And then let me just open up our presentation. Right. Everything look okay, Mary?
Yep.
All right. So today we are just going to talk I want to give you a series of questions for you to think through if you're entertaining some kind of career change. These questions are going to, they're going to hit identity. They're going to hit money. They're going to hit fulfillment, purpose. Again, I can't tell you a yes or no, even if you were to lay down your situation in front of us, that's a decision for you to make. But what we want to do is give you the tools so that you can make a decision yourself. Okay. So the first question, so there's 5 questions that I want you to ponder if you are thinking about making a career change, particularly if you're thinking of leaving. What we find often in the Rad Reads community is people who have high-paying jobs, but it's not it. That's not the thing that they want to do for the next 10, the next 20 years. But the golden handcuffs, the unvested stock, the lifestyle creep, the sunk cost of, I've been a lawyer for 20 years. I only know how to practice law. How on earth could I do something different, right? So the first thing that I want to encourage you to do is, as I mentioned in the story, is think about what are your experiments. I just had a tweet that looks like, I don't know if it's going to go viral, but it's catching a lot of steam and a little bit of flack because it's a little bit provocative. But the question is, what do you call someone who thinks they're one hobby away from happiness, yet they go to pursue the hobby and then give up because it's either too hard or didn't deliver on the promise of happiness? And so I list some of these hobbies out: learning how to DJ, becoming a YouTuber, starting a blog, learning how to surf, running a 10K, running an Ironman, learning design, learning art, illustration, right? And so the question that I ask here is, there is a belief often that if you're stuck in something, it's just one thing that will relieve you from that feeling of being stuck, right? And so for me, I felt stuck in the monotony of a corporate job where I was a specialist analyzing hedge funds. But what I really wanted to know, I didn't know what that thing was. And I wasn't convinced that it was one thing that would bring me that deep sense of purpose, satisfaction, and fulfillment, which is why I ran experiments. So I want you to think about this. Like, if you are contemplating doing something different, what is an experiment that you can run while you are still employed. Because there's a tremendous amount of advantages from running those experiments while you're still employed. You have financial cover. You have healthcare if you're in the United States, where it gets much harder to get healthcare once you leave the corporate realm. You have identity cover. That's going to be the fourth question, right? You can still say to people, yes, I'm a lawyer. Yes, I'm a doctor. Yes, I work on Wall Street. But you can start that experiment, right? And this is where it gets tricky, because some people say, oh, should I follow my passion? Following your passion is dangerous. I don't know. I can't answer that question for you. But what I can say is just take a couple units of time, a couple hours a week, a couple dollars. You could take a class, you could buy something that brings you towards that thing, but try the thing, right? Try the thing before you go out and make a wholehearted change, because you would be surprised. There are so many things that seem so perfect on paper. Working at a nonprofit is an example. I have a lot of friends who have left corporate jobs and had the financial runway to work at a nonprofit, and they get to the nonprofit and they realize the sheer volume of bureaucracy that turns them off completely from wanting that job. Now, imagine if there was a way that you could test that. How could you test working at a nonprofit or doing nonprofit-like activities without sacrificing your current job to make sure that's something you want to do? How can you test being a startup founder without becoming a startup founder immediately, while you still have the runway, the space, and the cover to do so? So I want you to each think about, if you're thinking about doing something different, I want you to think about what that experiment might be. It might be a creative experiment. It might be a business experiment. It might be an online experiment. And then try it. Try it with a bounded investment, meaning 1 hour a week, 3 hours a week. I'm going to spend $5,000 to try this thing, and then see how that feels. Don't do that after you leave. Do it while you are still employed, because it's going to give you clues about what makes you come alive and what you may not want to do. If you want to share into the chat, share with us what some of those experiments might be that you would try or that you have tried. Okay. The next one, there was a quote that I shared, that I saw the other day and I shared, and it says, if the cup of coffee doesn't make you happy, the yacht won't make you happy. And this is something that I really want you to think about, because I see this all the time with people trying to change jobs. Are you running to something? In that case, it might be the things that you have experimented with. Or are you running from something? Conflict, a bad boss, lack of fulfillment, boredom, low self-esteem, avoiding confrontation and conflict, perfectionism, imposter syndrome, right? Again, it's very easy to take something that's happening internally, right? Something, a deep, let's say it's a deep sense of inertia, like you can't start new things. You feel like you can't start anything. And to think that just by leaving, you will magically get that inertia. Low confidence is another one. If you're low confidence in your corporate job, you're scared to challenge people. You won't stand up in a meeting. You won't make yourself heard. You're not confident selling in front, presenting. A change of scenery often does not change that core insecurity or that core wound. And boy, it would be extremely disappointing, potentially, calamitous, to leave a job because you had low self-esteem, only to find that in your new opportunity, your sense of low self-esteem has still persisted, right? So this is where some deep inner work is required. It can be done with coaching. It can be done with journaling. It can be done with therapy. It can be done on a spiritual path. Again, that is for you. And I'm happy to share the tools I use, but that is for you to evaluate kind of for yourself, because everyone's going to have a different thing that they might be running from. Now, if you're running two, these are the experiments. If you find yourself staying up late, again, learning music or learning the principles of copywriting or graphic design, then there could be something to run to, right? And that is something that's more of a sign. And again, we're going to look at that in the fifth question. Does this bring me closer to aliveness? Okay. Now I want you to think as I'm saying this question. And if you feel comfortable dropping it into the chat, do you think you're running to something or do you think you're running from something? I'll leave it at that. If you feel comfortable sharing. And again, in my case, I was running to the sense of aliveness that I felt in those experiments. Now, there were definitely things that I was running from. There was a sense of like, I've only come to realize it in hindsight, like, am I good enough? Am I worthy of love? Why do I care so much about what people think about me, right? These are the inner work questions that still persist regardless whether you change the container that is your job. All right. This is probably the biggest question that everyone will ask in the process of career change, especially if you're leaving a high-paying job for a lower-paying job. Now, again, it's hard to give general advice across all different kinds of financial situations. Some people have trust funds and some people are living paychecks to paycheck. But if you're leaving a high-paying job, chances are you have built up a base of savings. So the question is, and I'd encourage you to drop it into the chat. If I asked you in 2022, what was my household spending for the year? Could you answer that question to the penny, to the nearest 10%, 5%, or within a 20% margin of error, right? So if you spend $100,000 a year, can you answer that within a range of 120 or 80,000? Like, would you be within that range? And the reason I ask is this is particularly acute. Again, this is how to leave a high-paying job. The thing about a high-paying job is that it often, one of the great things about it is that you don't need much financial discipline. You can basically say, as long as money in is greater than money out, I'm good. From that, you probably invest, you kind of no need to budget. I'm not a big budgeting person, but situations will change if you go from a high-paying job to a low-paying job, or to what we did, or I did, is entrepreneurship, where cash is just completely, to this day, completely volatile, right? Some months there's plenty, there's 5-month stretch with no income. Again, partially through my own design or my own fault, as you can imply. So I want you to know, just like, have you thought honestly about your finances? And you could look at your finances, and I would encourage them in 3 buckets. When I left, my wife said, she's like, I'm fine with you leaving, with us doing something differently, but I don't want you to stress out about money every time the bill comes, right? And so it was less about the change in financial situation, but it was about how the mindset would change, right? We already knew that we were living well below our means, and we knew that we had savings. Now, I think some of you probably asked, like, well, what's the magic number? You're probably saying, once I have X amount of saving, once I have $500,000 of saving, once I have $5 million of saving, once I have whatever, then I'll do it. And now that's not an unreasonable way to approach it. But something to keep note of is that irrespective of how much money is in your bank account. If you've only seen your bank account go up or stay flat in your life, seeing it go down, regardless of what number it went down from, is a terrifying experience. It incites your fight or flight reflex. If you bias towards scarcity thinking, you will freeze up. If the stock market loses, 10% in a week, you might change your spending patterns. So again, there's a deep, deep, deep relationship with money that you need to. It's very similar to the second question of what am I running from or what am I running to, right? So understand that, take a deep look at it, talk about it with your partner. They have to be, as their partner and potentially your kids have to be on the same page as you. Because if there's it's stressful enough to see that change for the primary breadwinner. But for the person, the secondary breadwinner, or if the other spouse doesn't work, it's even more, the roller coaster, the whiplash is more intense because they're actually removed from the act of making the money. So make sure that you've talked about that. For us, we took a bunch of savings, we put it in a different account, and we said, we're going to use this as the experimental fund. We're going to live off of this. I paid myself out of the experimental fund. It was about, depending on how you look at it, about 18 months of living expenses, and C would reevaluate where to go from there. Okay. Next, am I ready for an identity quake? This is probably the thing that people talk the least about. Now, I want you to think about, if you go into a new room, maybe you go to an alumni mixer, maybe you go to a PTA, new parents meeting, maybe you move into a new neighborhood. In the United States, probably one of the first 5 questions will be, what do you do? Now, when you're leaving a high-paying job, oftentimes, not always, you can be anchored to the prestige that comes with that job. You can be anchored with the story that comes to that job. If someone says, I'm a doctor, or I'm a surgeon, or someone says, I'm a corporate lawyer, if someone says, I am a CTO, all of those titles come with some kind of connotation. Some people don't give a shit. Some people care a lot. But that doesn't matter. It's how you identify with that title, right? I saw someone signed off in their signature, a friend of mine who's been struggled with this identity question. He left to take care of his young kids. He put in his signature, I'm on a dadical, like a sabbatical for a dad. But I know, having spoken to him, that he has struggled with how to introduce himself when he meets different kinds of people, how to even explain to your parents what you're doing, right? Wait, you went from being a managing director at Wall Street to writing an email newsletter? That is something that makes parents, a certain type of parent, very uncomfortable. And so you have to think about that identity quake. Now, the 5th question, and then we're going to open it up for about 20 minutes of Q&A. The 5th question is, does this bring me any closer to aliveness? And I tend to use the word aliveness over happiness, over fulfillment, over contentment, over life satisfaction. I love the phrase aliveness, right? Because so many things can make you feel alive. You can be alive when you're wrestling with your kids. You can be alive when you're training for a marathon. You can be alive when you're giving a sales presentation in front of a big client, right? Will this bring me closer to aliveness? Now, this is not to say that your job should be the ultimate container for aliveness. But if you're looking to leave a high-paying job for presumably a job with less income, probably there's some element of fulfillment, satisfaction, happiness that you are looking for. And so again, this is actually very similar to question 1 and question 2. Do I know what makes me come alive? Right? This is one of the questions that traditional retirees, at age 65 face, is they've been heads down, practicing, perfecting the scope of their career, but they don't really know how to live. I was listening to Bill Perkins, who wrote the phenomenal book Die with Zero, talk about many of his rich hedge fund and corporate friends who said they are so good at their jobs, so good, the best at their craft, but they don't know how to talk to their neighbor. They don't know how to host a dinner party. They don't know how to teach their kids how to ride a bike. And again, that's oftentimes those are conscious decisions that people have made. But the question is, especially if you're in this room thinking about that, thinking about making that jump, I gotta believe that aliveness is something that you're looking for. And aliveness is not this switch that comes with a change in job. It doesn't come by winning the lottery. It doesn't come when you get a promotion. Aliveness is a much deeper sense of integration with who you are, a deep understanding of your desires, your joys, and again, question 2, your insecurities, your unhealed wounds, right? It's this collection of this all. And so we can start experimenting, discovering our aliveness long before we quit our jobs. So these are 5 questions. Again, they are not the end-all be-all questions, but I hope that they give you some kind of canvas, some set of guiding principles so that you can evaluate a career change for yourself, especially one that involves the sacrifice of making potentially less money. So with that, we've got about 20 minutes. Because we've got people on different channels, I'm going to ask Marion to kind of guide the questions. But if you are on this Zoom call, I will ask you if you'd like to unmute so we can have a little conversation.
Patricia is in the Zoom room, and if she would like to come on the stage, she is welcome. Otherwise, I will speak her question out loud. She asked, what could you take in terms of expertise into your new life, and how did you transfer the sound parts of your professional identity over to your new career?
Okay. How did you transfer the sound parts of your identity into your new career? And the skills question was the first one. How did you transfer your skills? So let's start with the skills question. The skills question is, it's an interesting one. Mary, if you could pull up the specialist versus generalist article, but I think of it generically as a martini glass. So you start off, you don't know anything. You graduated college, you've got a major in, marketing or business management, or God forbid, the liberal arts. I wish I had a major in the liberal arts, but you're a generalist. And so you're going to learn on the job. So you're a generalist. That's the base of the martini glass. Then the martini glass gets narrow because you inevitably will specialize in something, marketing or finance or sales, creative, and you will refine that creative muscle and become more skilled, more valuable to your company. And then the glass opens again, the mouth of the glass, where if you think of like Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, he's got to understand regulation, law, marketing, business strategy, leadership, and so on. So I think of that. So if you are later in your career, you might already be in the mouth of the martini glass, where you've got a bunch of different skills. You know how to manage teams, right? You know how to lead. Even if you're not a salesperson, oftentimes you need to know how to sell. You know how to rally influence within an organization to make decisions, right? And obviously, the stem of the martini glass will be a deep, deep level of expertise. Now, here's where storytelling narrative building really becomes important. A perfect example would be someone who's, let's say, a Navy SEAL. A Navy SEAL, and this is quite common, Navy SEAL leaves the SEALs, gets an MBA or some kind of advanced degree, and then enters the workforce. they're 30, 32 years old, but they've actually never used Excel before. They've rarely sat in front of a desk other than their MBA program. So now it's incumbent on this Navy SEAL to convince the employer that they have the relevant skills for that job. So again, if they're going into something that's more sales oriented, maybe they lean into the skills of managing, my military terminology is not good, but a squad of people. Or maybe it's how they dealt with uncertainty, where, they had a plan going into a mission, and then immediately the plan was thrown upside down by something they couldn't have anticipated. Or maybe it's how they think about risk management on, do I risk losing this, this colleague? Do I risk putting people in harm's way? How do you think about risk management when you are doing a raid, right? That is a narrative that you will have to tell. So again, think about the skills, kind of abstract them away, but also think about the presentation thereof, right? If you're a salesperson on Wall Street selling securities and you want to enter business development at a startup, you could think about, hone in on your secret sauce for building and maintaining authentic relationships, right? Okay, the next question, which healthy parts did you keep of the identity? So we have a podcast where we're going to talk about prestige games. That episode will be out in 3 weeks. So we talk a lot about this. I think I had a very shaky relationship with identity because I was living in New York. I was, very high in the corporate ladder at a very young age. And, people in that city know what that means, right? And so there's, from an ego perspective, it feels really good when you walk in and you're like, hey, I'm this, I'm that, I work at this. And some people might even say, like, oh, wow, that's impressive, or that's great, So I was very attached to those things. And when you rip the plug out, they get you can't use that anymore. You can try, but you can't use that anymore. You're a former, you're a this. The thing that almost brought me back into the corporate world was a text. And I got this text about 100 times my first year after I left. And the message was very simple. It said, what are you doing? And normally, like, ARE was all caps, or doing was all caps, or it was like question mark, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point. And this is where this is when there was an identity vacuum, right? I didn't know who I was or how to present myself to the world professionally. And in the West, or in America, or especially in coastal cities, how you present yourself professionally is a huge part of how you present yourself, period. I didn't know how to present myself. And when I got these texts, what I thought was people were judging me. In that vacuum of identity, what I was hearing was, you're lazy. You've lost your mind. You're really confused. Is something wrong in your relationship? Again, there was a vacuum. And so from that vacuum, you fill it up, usually with your insecurities. All right. You don't fill it up with like, I'm so confident and so thriving on these creative projects that I have no idea where they're going, but I just feel so great about it and I surf. No, like that's not what comes to mind when you feel insecure. When you feel insecure, you're like, what the fuck is this person saying about me when I'm not around? And it's a dangerous, it's a scary place to be when you're living in that identity vacuum. So you have to go. I think there's two paths here. I think there's a much deeper philosophical path of like, what does an identity mean, period, right? If you think about it on your deathbed, you think you're like, I'm so glad I was the managing director on BlackRock, right? No, you probably don't. 5 years before you pass, or you're like, back in the day when I was working on Wall Street, little fella, to your grandkids, probably not. 20 years before? Yeah, you're like, yeah, I was hot shit 10 years ago, right? And so it's just an interesting thing. Like identity is we get attached. Human beings have attachments. We get attached to our sense of self. We get attached to the way in which our sense of self is built. And once you remove that, you can feel lost. But there's another way through inner work to understand that an identity is fleeting, right? There are different spiritual traditions that say just clinging to an identity, even a healthy one, like I am a husband, like one day I might not be a husband because my spouse will have passed. If my identity is clinged to the belief that I'm a husband, what happens when I'm no longer a husband? Or maybe an identity is I'm a fit person. One day I won't be fit. If my sense of self comes from being fit, what will happen when that's taken away from me? You can keep repeating that over and over and over again. And again, deep inner work, it involves, you could call it ego, you can call it identity, you can call it attachment. There's a lot of different ways, but it's a healthy relationship with that sense of self that transcends leaving a job or not. On the other side of things, you build it back up, right? To me, the identity has always been in the thing that I do versus who it makes me. So I love writing, but I struggle to call myself a writer, right? So for me, it's been more in the creative act of the things, that is where I kind of connect with my sense of self and my sense of identity. Great questions.
Nicole asks, how do you know if you have found the thing that makes you have aliveness?
Great question. Now there's I think the traditional answer, you would get this in, things like The Artist's Way from Julia Cameron. It's kind of, or Michaelish, I'm going to butcher his last name, who wrote the book Flow. It's kind of sense of flow, a sense of losing yourself in time, right? I think there's another way, in a running too, is you think about the thing all the time, right? I've been writing a weekly blog post for 250 consecutive weeks. And I'd say 20 of the 250 weeks, I've said to myself, oh, I wish I didn't have to do this. The other 230, I'm like, oh, I'm excited to do this thing, right? And it's not, I don't make it into a mountain that it is not, but it is just this, which gets kind of to the next point, is a deep sense of peace, right? The inner chatter, whether it's, you're not doing this enough, you're not doing it well enough, you're not doing it fast enough, or what is this person going to think? What is that person is going to think? What is that person going to think? Or is this going to get likes? Are people going to validate this? Are people going to like this? I think that peace comes from that chatter dissipating. And when that chatter dissipates, you are truly present in the activity, in the writing, in the spread. I know a lot of people that find flow in a beautiful Excel model, right? They find peace. There's that creative problem solving. There's the satisfaction of the keys, clicking on the keyboard. There's the perfection of, hitting F9 and watching the cash flow waterfalls run through the model and spitting out whether you should buy the company or whether it's dilutive or accretive, right? There's so many different ways to find that flow. And the first one, Nicole, is just awareness. I think people are not aware of their aliveness often because there's a tendency for the mind to go to the future. Like, when I get this promotion, then I'll be happy, or go to the past. Like, oh, wasn't it amazing that time when I rode that wave? And again, it doesn't mean to ignore the future or to just, avoid nostalgia. But you still, one can become too attached to it, right? You see that with aging. People get too attached to the nostalgia of their younger self, how their hair looked, what their body looked like, how other people treated them when they came into the room. And that's an unhealthy attachment because every single one of us ages. And we will never look like we did when we were in our 20s, right? It's by definition. So if you have that attachment to the past, it can cloud the aliveness, right? It can cloud the aliveness. If you're surfing a wave in your 70s and all you're remembering is how good you were in your 20s, you're not enjoying that wave in your 70s, right? Because you're clinging to that past. So that would be a few ways. One book that has deeply impacted me on the question of aliveness, I was very apprehensive about it. I thought it was like a corny spiritual book, is The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. It is a beautiful meditation on kind of how the mind winds up stories about all of these things, and they rob us from, he will call it the now. To me, it's like the aliveness that you feel in any given moment, because we have the capacity in any moment to be alive. And then if you can create, if you have a sense of what that is, right? Teaching, speaking, creating, connecting people, telling stories, that Excel model, the Microsoft Excel model, like if you have a sense of this, you will be closer. And you do not need to change jobs to find clues of that aliveness.
JD asks, how much runway do you recommend, or is it better to experiment and get traction first before quitting?
Mm-hmm. The runway question. It's a great question, and it's such a hard question to answer because there's so many variables, right? So, for example, maybe you're immunocompromised, and having worse insurance is not an option. I'm talking about the United States here, where it's much harder to get insurance if you're self-employed. Or maybe you have aging parents and you need to support them a specific way. Or maybe, and this would be our case, like we have a somewhat expensive lifestyle. Mostly we love to live in high cost of living cities. We live in New York, we live in LA. If we were to move, we would probably move to Paris or London. We love living in expensive cities. So by definition, the runway will be higher for us because we're not willing, as part of the analysis as a couple, we're not willing to sacrifice on where we live to for me to change jobs. We're both in agreement on that. So with the fact, given that everyone has these different parameters, I think that there's one thing that people, again, I want to frame this on the high paying, not just quitting any job. This is how do you leave a high paying job? I think that what most people with a high paying job misunderstand is that they're very employable, even if they make a change. So I'll give you a very quick story. I had a friend who was a VP at a consumer products company, got poached, high salary, good experience, well-known in the industry, got poached to go to a small startup to be the CFO, walks, huge pay cut, lots of equity, upside. First day as a CFO, realized that they lied to him about the finances. There's 6 months of runway. Wife has an autoimmune condition, and he's just terrified that he's put his family at risk, financial risk, health risk. And so I asked him, what would happen if you went back to your old company and said, guys, I screwed up. Can I have my job back? He said, oh, they'd give it to me right away. They love me. They love me. I didn't burn any bridges. So I said, what are you scared about? Right? They go back to the same healthcare, back to the same paycheck. Now, not everyone has the luxury of going back to the exact same job, but if you leave a job with transparency, without burning bridges, honoring every exit clause that's in your non-compete, your gardening leave, et cetera, you are employable. In fact, when you try something new, you become even more employable because you have widened your scope of expertise. I still get recruited for finance jobs, and I haven't written about finance, done any financial analysis in 8 years. What I do now is more interesting. It makes me more interesting through the lens of a financial services employer. Not all jobs, but certain jobs. In fact, people now would hire me for a sales job in finance. That's what I get recruited for usually, where before I was on the analysis side. What did that story about my friend share? It's the ego, the shame that he made a mistake and asking for his job back. Do not confuse that shame for financial security. They are two different things. You could be deeply ashamed and embarrassed and be financially secure. It's still going to feel super awkward, but they're not the same thing. So you have to be honest with yourself about that. So to answer your question about the runway, again, it's going to depend on the levers. I would say, I would think honestly, it's like I would kind of try to anticipate what you think your spending is. Usually I would add 20% to that because we tend to underestimate our spending. Think about how long you feel comfortable doing that. And think about what your backup plan might be, right? If it doesn't work out. My backup plan was, I'll just go back to the industry. It's still, if things were to get super rough, still would be my backup plan. And also along the way, all of these other jobs have opened up. Like I could now get a job at a FANG company if I needed to, Facebook, Apple, and some kind of hybrid between financial services and marketing. Like I know that that's possible. It would be significantly less than I was earning when I was on Wall Street, but it would be plenty to support the lifestyle that we want to live. So I would think about your runway, think about how you're going to spend, think about what you want to do. Is the thing you're going to do cost you money? Like Rad Reads cost me a little bit of money, not that much, but it's still, $500, $1,000 a month for different tech services and getting a WeWork space. Again, things that you may or may not need. And then think about what that plan would look like. To answer the question, Nicole's question, the friend didn't go back. He stayed at the startup for like a year. They had a little bit of extra runway. And then he got another job at another startup, actually. So that job put him in the radar of other startup jobs, and he stayed in the startup industry. And to this day, he stayed in the startup industry. And he actually had a company that just went public. So you could see how that trajectory kind of played out.
Awesome. Our last question comes from Sean. Sean asks, you alluded to it, but can you talk even more directly to your journey with fear of judgment of others? In some way that feels like the fear underlying all fears.
Ooh.
Did you change your definition of success? Did you cut people out or off, etc.?
Beautiful question. I would say a lot of it. I mean, a lot of I think fundamentally one thing that I've learned to realize, I've been doing different modalities of therapy and coaching for about a decade now. And before that, I had done none. So when I quit, I basically had done nothing. And now I've learned a lot about myself. I think the biggest challenge for me in the judgment is that I want people to know that I'm a good person. I have a deep fear of not being good. And again, we can talk about what exactly good means. And from this kind of fear of like a lack of inherent goodness comes kind of a downstream fear of like am I worthy of love? And so the inner work through, again, countless different modalities, and which I'm still doing, has been to kind of heal that part, that wound, right? And again, my parents are amazing parents. They, I had no kind of trauma, no abuse, none of that stuff. We were middle class, but again, a lot of that is your lived experience. And a lot of that are the thoughts that are happening between your two ears. And so to answer the question, I fear judgment. I still feel judgment, but now I know that when I get triggered by judgment, it questions my sense of wholeness and of goodness. And I have a practice that affirms that this goodness is not conditional. It's like deeply internal. It doesn't mean that I always feel it, but I have a way of returning to that practice and returning to that feeling through a variety of different tools, meditation, journaling, different mantras, things like that, different things that I can say to myself. So those are the tools, but it never goes away. Like I still get super jealous. Recently, you stay out of finance for 10 years and, people are making $1 million, $2 million a year. The person who was sitting next to you has 15 million bucks. And you're like, what the fuck? They were just average, and so, you can start to really question yourself when, we fight and claw and for, $4,000 check. So you can start to, again, it can trigger whatever low self-esteem question, which is that question 2 that you have for yourself, can be triggered from situations like that. So Azul, I know you raised your hand, but unfortunately we have to run because we actually have a group coaching. So we have a group coaching program where we literally talk about this and all the different flavors of personal, of career change, of leading fulfilled and rich inner lives, tying that to productivity, tying that to time. These are really small groups. This cohort is 3 people. So if that's something of interest, continue. But again, it's really aimed at this question where, at a group of people where the first 2 layers of Maslow's hierarchy, you're not worried about food, you're not worried about shelter, you're really worried about what people will say about you behind your back, right? It's for that type of person, which is kind of why we frame these types of coaching and events towards that more experienced group of professionals. So Azul, text me your question and I'll answer it. With that, I thank you all. Thank you, Marianne. We've written a ton about these topics. If some of you want to explore the group coaching, our next cohort will probably start in August or after Labor Day in the US. And then we are exploring these questions in our podcast. I know Marianne dropped the link in. Today, we have a recording with Carl Richards. Get this. Why do we fear being ordinary? That's the question that we're going to explore. We're not going to answer it. We are just going to explore that question. And again, these are some of the questions that we will cover in group coaching and in other workshops that we run. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you. Have a great summer if we don't see you.